if I had to pick a handful of days, one of the most powerful days on my own faith journey. Because what I witnessed was specifically this one mother named Santos, who had been praying and fasting around the clock for days to be reunited with her child. Sure enough, it was the day we released our podcast episode, on her birthday, that they got a call that her son just happened to be 2 miles down the road at a detention facility, and they were reunited.
Today's episode of the Significant Women podcast is sobering and encouraging. I can't wait for you to meet my guest, Julie Mirlicourtois. She worked for Oprah for many years, as well as for network TV in New York City. And she's always been digging for truth ever since she was a young woman. She was digging for truth before she met the Lord. For most of her life, Julie has described herself as spiritual, but not religious. However, after a series of events following her move to Houston, Texas, she couldn't deny God's existence or his plan for her life. It was there in Texas as a young mom that Julie came face to face with God, and the trajectory of her life changed for all of eternity. I can't wait for you to listen to my conversation with Julie. It's a challenging one, but it is riveting. I know you're going to want to hear her incredible story. This is Carol McLeod, and you're listening to the Significant Women podcast. As you know, every episode is filled with personal stories. It's filled with hope and pain and joy. It's filled with laughter and tears. But every women's story is valuable, and I can't wait for you to hear the story of Julie Mirlicourtois. I'm so thrilled to have you today. And I wanted to start our conversation by asking you a little girl question. I want to know, Julie, when you were a little girl, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't thought about this in a while. I loved Indiana Jones, and I loved ancient Egypt. So I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was, I'd say, 10 years old.
Really? That is so
Yeah.
interesting. Julie, you're the first person I've ever talked to, especially a woman, who said she wanted to be an archaeologist. I love that. And so the career path you're on is pretty far
Mhm.
removed from archaeology, but there's
Yeah.
that. So I love that, an archaeologist. Uh,
By the time I was 14, I had changed my, goals, but that was initially the very first thing I wanted to be.
and so when you were 14, what did you want to be?
Well, that's when I accidentally stumbled into a television studio at my high school and learned production. And that was one of the times, I think, if I look back, I look back and see God working in my life throughout, but that was one of the times where I literally felt like he picked me up and put me in a place and said, "This is your purpose right here," at 14 years old. And I'm so blessed that that happened.
Wow, you must have had like an advanced or a technological high school for, that many, a couple decades ago, for them to have a TV production studio.
It was honestly just a little public school in central Massachusetts, nowhere special. And they just, it's funny, the television studio produced all of the like community, they used to have community access
Yep.
cable stations. Do they still
Mhm.
have those? I don't even know. Where, and the school committee meetings would be live. And so somebody, I must guess, must have gotten the idea, let's have the students be the ones to record and report on the school committee meetings. And we had a little TV show. Um, and that's where I also just, I had a passion for telling stories. I had no idea, but I was still kind of, in many ways, for a long time, processing my own story that was a difficult one. And so I think I found a lot of healing in sharing other people's stories. And some of the stories I shared when I was 14 years old, as reporting, I look back on, I'm like, wow, that was a little, I think one of my first big human interest stories was about domestic violence victims. So
Really?
I think it was just one of those things, I was drawn to sharing the hard stories. And I lived in a place where it felt very much like a bubble. I felt very much like I was kind of the only one dealing with some of the issues, which I think is a
Feel your own story, pain. Why do you think that's true?
I think, I mean, we talk about vulnerability so much now, Brene Brown and all that, but back then, in the early 90s, we, especially growing up in Massachusetts, very puritanical roots, we didn't talk to each other, and my family very much swept everything under the rug. Half of my family, I'm half French, so I had a French father who was the complete opposite. Let's make drama out of every part of our life. But I mostly was living, except for the summers, in Massachusetts, and that culture was really hard for me because people didn't talk about things. So I think it was just what we know now is so good for us. I don't know if you know Dr. Kurt Thompson. We've had him on our podcast a couple of times. He's a phenomenal Christian psychiatrist,
Oh.
and he talks about vulnerability from a Christian perspective. And we know now how that, having a group of people that we can be confessional with is just so vital to our faith and to our health. But that's not something people talked about back then.
No, it really wasn't, and being raised in New England, there's that New England stiff upper lip, which
Yeah,
you are probably that was your mindset at the time.
yeah.
But how wonderful to know that you have discovered over the years the power of story and how that the vulnerability does heal us. I think about what the Bible says about speaking the truth in love, that when we can tell our truth, frame it with the love of God and how we've seen his hand, it becomes a power tool in our own hands. So I love that. But Julie, now tell us about your faith journey. So I don't believe you were raised in a Christian home. When did you come to the point? One thing I read about you is you're spiritual, not religious. I love that. But what happened that you suddenly said, God is real and Jesus is his son who came to forgive me and help me live abundantly? What happened inside of you? When did that happen?
Yeah, I'll back up a little bit because I think it's important to know how crazy it was that that even happened to me because I was spiritual but not religious, but I grew up with a French father who was raised in the Catholic Church in France in the 40s and 50s. Very much the religion was forced upon him. His mom made him be an altar boy. And so by the time I came along, he refused to have me baptized. And he, basically convinced me that all religion was brainwashing. And then what they say about the media world being very secular is very true, and I would say even anti-religion in many ways. Being at a network news station, but also even being at a talk show where we were very leery of any organizations that had a religious bent to them,
Mm.
and so that was very much my world. However, I was a seeker from an early age. I actually started praying when I was 8 years old. My parents went through a really terrible divorce and dragged me through it quite a bit. And I remember. But I guess that's what it was when I worked
Mm.
I worked for Oprah Winfrey. Something open in me. And so I look back and I warn people about psychics all the time, but I realized that God was going to reach me however he could.
Wow.
So that's kind of what started in my early 30s was like, oh, I have proof now. I have proof that there's something bigger than me, that I can trust in something that's leading me. And when I was about 34 years old, I heard very clearly, which I realize now was God saying, go home and tell your husband you're moving to Texas, which is the last thing I wanted to hear. We met on a blind date in New York City, and he told me he wanted to move to Texas. And I said I was never going to move to Texas, so this relationship wouldn't work out. Well, fast forward 8 years later, I hear God telling me to move to Texas, and I was like, what is this? This is nuts. But we have family in Texas, and his company had been based here for a long time in Houston, and they'd been asking us to come down. And so, I just felt so strongly that's what I needed to do. It was just one of those things where the sort of the reason part of my brain shut down, and I just knew and I felt that I was being called to Texas. And moved to Texas only a few weeks later. I literally was like, let's pack up, let's go. Stayed in a friend's rental that happened to be available. And for the first 6 months, I just saw, I've never felt God so strongly working in my life with every single person he put in my path. Um, Everything that unfolded. I mean, I'd be here for an hour telling you about it, but I heard somebody else talking about their own faith testimony, and I thought, yes, that's it. And what was happening was everybody I was encountering was talking about Jesus, and everybody was pointing me in the direction of Jesus, whether I knew it or not at the time. It was just like it was like, oh gosh, like here's another thing I'm hearing about Jesus and how this applies to my life, and this makes so much sense. And then around the same time, I walked into a church one day looking for a school for my daughter. Um, and I felt this immediate sense of home and peace and comfort, which is strange because I didn't go up growing to church. And I ended up putting her in that school. And they had a new church plant within the larger church that was geared for non-religious people that had just started a few months earlier. And I convinced my husband, who is not a believer, I said, let's just check out this church. It could be good for our kids. Um, and, within just a couple of months, again, just everything I was hearing about Jesus, everything I was experiencing in my life, all the sort of, it was a hard time. It was a very hard time, completely changed everything in my life that I had been working towards, and took a huge pay cut because I wasn't working. And we only had my husband's salary, and we were trying to rebuild our lives with two young kids, and it was really challenging. But I felt so provided for and
Mm,
cared for by God and
mm.
by the Christian community, and just opened up my Bible and started reading and realizing that sort of all the answers I had been looking for and seeking along the way were all right there for me.
Wow. That's quite the story, Julie, to see how God pursued you, how he chased you down and got your attention in a powerful yet very loving way. Um, so as you referenced, Julie, you did work for Oprah, um, one of the most amazing women of our period in history. You also were a producer for the CBS News. How did working at those different places prepare you for what you are now doing today?
I mean, it just gave me the most incredible experience. I think I'm the best producer I could possibly be because I went through, first working at a news station, very, man's world, very, investigative reporting a type of world, which was really neat, taught me to really dig for answers. And I actually, when I moved to New York City to work for CBS News, a month later, 9/11 hit,
Mm,
and then obviously the Iraq War. And so that was my entry into the news world. And it was very much there was a point where I had to decide, okay, do I want to run away with all the other New Yorkers out of this place? Or am I going to stay here, and really, fight for this career that I want in journalism? And so that was really powerful in so many ways. And there are so many people with so much integrity that I just learned so much from along the way. So many amazing. And how creative can we get? And how wild can these shows be? But it was fun, it was thrilling, but it also really allowed me to flex some muscles that I hadn't really flexed before as far as the creativity aspect of it. So yeah, it prepared me in so many ways, and I realize now that I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing right now if I hadn't had that preparation. And so I do think, God had a plan for those years, even though I felt like I didn't really know what I was doing, where I was going, or where I was headed.
Yeah, I've heard it said that God wastes nothing. And we can really see that in your life, how God took all this excellent secular experience and now is using it for a greater good. But before we talk about what you're doing today, I have one more question for you about those
Mhm.
years when you
Yeah.
were working for Oprah and CBS. And I was thinking how I didn't want to gossip about people. So I thought, Carol, how can you frame the question? So this is how I'm going to frame it for you, Julie. Julie, when you were working at these high level positions with people that we all know about, who was the nicest, kindest person you ever
Mm.
worked with during those years?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, this is not a name people are going to recognize, so
That's
that
okay.
might be that might be disappointing. But when I was at CBS News, I worked for a man. His name is Michael Bass. He's now one of the vice presidents at CNN. Um, and he was just one of the smartest men I had ever met. Harvard grad, came from a long line of authors and just brilliant people. And he took me under his wing when I was an assistant for him at CBS News and taught me, and this was again during the Iraq War, taught me everything he knew about television. He allowed me to be in every meeting with all the senior producers just to absorb and learn. Um, and he had a lot of things he had done. He was one of the people that launched Katie Couric and Matt Lauer on the Today Show.
Mm.
He had a lot of amazing credentials that could have gotten to his head, but he is one of the kindest human beings I've ever met. And to this day, I have a wonderful friendship with him, and I just value and respect that friendship so much.
I just love that so much, Julie, because oftentimes it's the people behind the scenes who are the most impactful.
The world that I worked in was not a kind place.
Mm.
There was a lot of competition. There was a lot of, I mean, there were wonderful people, but there was a lot of, insecurities and people trying to cut each other down. And so he set the example for me, that when I was, in charge of a team at Oprah and stuff, I chose to lead differently. That, you can be in this highly competitive, very stressful world, but remain who you are, and be kind towards other people. And it's not easy to find that in that world. So it was really unique.
No, and I mean, I think of the proverb that says, "Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at our hearts." And so to have a kind, encouraging heart is more valuable than promotions or a high salary or awards in the world because God is going after our hearts. So you learned that lesson even in a secular environment. And that's a powerful testimony. Well, we'll get back to Julie's story in just a minute. But when this episode releases, we'll be knocking on the door of the Christmas season. Now, I don't know when you're listening to this episode, but let me tell you, every time of the year, whether it's November or July, is a great time to remember that we're a Christmas people. Something so wonderful has happened to us that nothing will ever be the same again. Genesis chapter 1 records the first spoken words of God. Let there be light. Those were the words that are recorded that God spoke. He brought his light into the darkness. And when Jesus was born, as referenced in Luke chapter 2, the angels sang this song. Behold, we bring you good news of great joy, which shall be to all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. So when Jesus was born, God the Father declared through the voices of the angels, let there be joy. As most of you know, I love Christmas. And so I've written a Christmas devotional titled, Let There Be Joy. It's a 25-day journey to Christmas, and I'd love for you to get a copy for yourself as well as for all of your friends. It actually makes a great Thanksgiving gift to hand out at the Thanksgiving table. You can order Let There Be Joy on Amazon, at christianbooks.com, or at my website, which is Carol McLeod Ministries. And now, let's get back to my conversation with Julie. But now we're going to talk about what you're involved in today, because the move to Texas was so strategic for you, it seems to me. And God has opened some amazing doors, but now you're involved in a documentary, in a series called Across. Tell us about that.
Well, I'll start by telling you when I podcast, and it very much like our church, we're trying to reach non-religious people. So now I'm doing work that I hope reaches people that, like me, 8 years ago. Um, and so we cover all sorts of issues that we think keep people away from church, away from faith. We've done everything from shame and depression to sexuality and um, all sorts of things. Wrongfully accused. We just share amazing stories, and we're not preaching to people as much as just having them consider maybe things that they didn't consider before, specifically about Jesus. And so we did an episode in 2019 about immigration. It's a little bit of a catchy title. It's called "Can Loving Illegals," in quotes, Save Our Souls? And it was featuring this pastor I'd been introduced to in San Antonio. One of my former secular colleagues reached out to me and said, "I met this pastor. I interviewed him for a show. I think you'd love him. I heard you're a Christian now." And so I drove out to San Antonio and I met this pastor, and even more impactful, his entire Christian community that had created a hospitality house for asylum seekers that were passing through San Antonio. Because when people cross the border, they automatically go through San Antonio on their way to sponsors and that sort of thing. And in their hospitality house, they were really rescuing often women and children who either their sponsors were not true sponsors, but they were basically walking into the hands of human traffickers, or the mothers that were separated from their children at the border and had no idea what to do. And so when I drove out to San Antonio with my recording equipment to do a podcast episode, and I ended up sitting around the kitchen table in their hospitality house all day with this pastor and with these asylum seekers. And even though I don't speak Spanish, that was, if I had to pick a handful of days, one of the most powerful days on my own faith journey. Because what I witnessed was specifically this one mother named Santos, who had been praying and fasting around the clock for days to be reunited with her child. And I remember the pastor saying to me, she thinks she believes God made her a promise and that she's going to be reunited with her son soon, but we have no idea where he is, and we have no idea, and I'm just not. And this was in the height of the news of of family separations and
Yeah.
sort of these impossible reunifications, and he was not feeling hopeful, and his American Christian community was not feeling hopeful, but she had this overwhelming confidence that God, I'm just not. And this was in the height of the news of patients and
Yeah.
sort of these impossible, and he was not feeling. American Christian community was not feeling hopeful. Confidence that God was in the height of the news of patients and
Yeah.
sort of these impossible. American Christian confidence that God was in the height of the news of sort of these impossible. American Christian was in the height of the news of sort of these impossible. American Christian was in the height of the news of sort of these impossible American Christian was in the height of the news of sort of these impossible American Christian was in the height of the news of sort of these impossible American Christian was in the height of the news of sort of these impossible American Christian sort of these impossible